I am Skye Aney, and today I'm going to be presenting a little bit about the grass finishing part of our supply chain analysis. So I'm not going to rehash what Sherry introduced this morning, but the basis of our project, we're researching these three novel strategies, one of which is grass finishing, well, one of which is the supply chain options. And among those options, grass finishing on desert rangelands is one of those options, and that is the topic of some research that the extension team has done to kind of get an idea. So first of all, what we wanted to do is we can't start doing analysis until we know what's out there. So our first objective was to locate grass finished producers within the footprint of our project area, and then send out a survey to them to get some basic, just basic characteristics of what their operations look like. Visualize that data spatially, start to do some analysis on it. And then also we have a couple more surveys planned to calibrate some spatial models and then also some economic models. So the distribution and physical characteristics, we have kind of two swaths, and I will say that this was all gathered from public information. So there may be some other ranches out there that did not have an online presence, and we weren't able to locate them. But you can see over here in the Plains region, it's very much tends to be more in the east. And then in New Mexico, Colorado, there's this kind of swath, sort of at the mid elevations, which is not surprising. You need a little bit of rain in order to grow that grass. It was interesting that sort of as, you know, again, no surprise, but as the temperature rose, tended to see the operations in areas with a little bit more rain. The minimum here was about 225 millimeters, which is just a little shy of 9 inches of rain annual per year. So pretty dry conditions. And then the top range was about 47 inches per year. As far as management characteristics, we looked at, there we go. We looked at the breeds raised, and most of the producers were raising British. A few were raising some continental and British crosses. A few were actually already raising Spanish heritage breeds. And a few were raising some exotic breeds like an African breed of cattle or a Japanese Wagyu cattle crossed with some other British breeds. And several of these also reported using some three-way hybrids. Calves average daily gain, the most common was about 1.5 to 2 pounds per day. And then the second most common was about 2.5 to 3 pounds per day. Some producers indicated a difference between summer and winter. And interestingly, a lot of them didn't know or did not keep track. So of the survey results, the management, a few more details, about 32% of the respondents raised more than one breed of cattle. So sort of diversifying their assets there. 78% of respondents indicated that their cattle spent at least 75% of their time on native rangeland and grassland. A few also graze on irrigated pasture or on some sort of seeded pasture. 36% of respondents graze and feed legumes, about 68% supplement with hay, usually no more than 50% of the diet in both cases. But the interesting thing, what that tells us is even in these areas with higher rainfall, clearly the grass is not enough. They are finding the need to supplement as well by feed. Almost all report finishing their cattle on their ranch. There were only a couple that said that they sold them as feeders to other operations or maintained ownership through a forage-based feedlot. And 86% maintain a constant herd. So they are feeding those mama cows year round. As far as marketing and sales, grass-fed beef marketing channels, we listed sort of a diversity of options, and we found that in actual fact, most people were marketing their calves through multiple channels. They were also diversifying, about half of them were diversifying with other sources of on-ranch income, such as raising another crop on their property, or custom grazing cattle, raising other livestock. And then 61% supplement with off-ranch income, and that should be no surprise. I think that's pretty common throughout the ranching community in general. Over three-quarters of the survey respondents indicated that at least 50% of their usual customer base are repeat customers. So once they build up that customer base, they can kind of keep it going. Marketing and sales. Interestingly, sort of on that customer-based thought, we asked about the COVID impacts. And while some of them definitely were impacted by COVID and those bottlenecks, about half said that in actual fact, it really didn't change anything for them. And the disruptions, again, 48% moderate changes to the way they marketed their cattle. Some switched to online sales only, some switched to just postal. But this could be an opportunity. You know, one of those strategies was that a lot of those producers had booked their processor slots a year in advance. So they already had their slots. When everybody else couldn't get their calves processed, they could. So interesting, this could build some robustness. You know, these producers can build some robustness into the supply chain when something big like that happens, where the commercial feedlot system sort of breaks down. And we asked about just some of the reasons that people started raising grass-fed beef. A lot of them started for economic reasons, and a lot of them continue because economic reasons. They find they have better control over their return and the risk management. They found that they could get a premium for those grass-fed beef, and that there was a demand for it. Human health was another big one for why they started. But then when we asked, when we got over here to why they continue, a lot of them really found it rewarding. Said it was exciting, it was fun, they liked doing it. Other personal reasons were things like family history, personal convictions about the way the land should be managed, etc. And we asked about some of the potential barriers. I mean, who best to know what the barriers are than the people doing it? No surprise, processor availability is a big one. Drought is another big one in our region. And some just said, you know, personal management. If you're not into it, you're not into it. Marketing demands, they said that it does take quite a long time to market, a lot of effort. Market access, if you're not near a customer base where you have people who are concerned about buying grass-fed beef, then it's going to be hard for you to make it. And then just a lack of capital, lack of resources. We heard in the plenary at the beginning of this conference, a new rancher talking about that, about how do you get loans to get shares to actually get the land. So that was another cited barrier. And then a little bit off the grass-fed topic, but we also wanted to know, because we do extension work, you know, what kind of decision support tools do people use? What kind of things are helpful to their operation? We found that the top two were, interestingly, static web page of information and offline resources from research-based agencies or extension. So, you know, what that tells us is if we're putting together tools for this audience, these might be the ones we want to shoot for, because these are the ones that people are actually finding useful, which is really interesting when I think about, you know, the amount of time and effort that is often spent into creating things like apps and more dynamic tools. And these are clearly not being picked up and used, at least by the producers that we surveyed. And there might be several reasons for that, but so research-based information helpful to the operation, drought adaptation and management, beef supply chain options, no surprises there either. Those were the two biggest. And then a lot of people were actually interested in the heritage cattle characteristics and foraging behavior, as well as the carcass qualities and some precision ranching technologies. Interestingly, also of those top two information sources, 33% of respondents choosing did not look for any other options other than a static web page. And for the offline resources, about 40% also did not indicate any other options. So that is their sole source of information from the options we gave them. And yeah, as I said, this might tell us we might need to take this into consideration when we're creating tools. And also maybe do some PR, some workshops for some of those other tools out there, because I know there's some pretty neat ones like the Cornell Meat Calculator that can really help you with your pricing. So what's next? So this was our preliminary survey. This was just getting some general characteristics, general ideas. We are planning an additional survey to gather a little bit more refined information so that we can start calibrating a model. looking at things like bottlenecks and supply chain linkages, different supply chains for different producers, livestock sources, and then, getting some spatial information. So this is going to be a spatial model, going to be looking at constraints, social constraints, environmental constraints, and kind of taking all of these multiple parts of the supply chain into account. Cooperators are NMSU, USDA. We want to give a shout out to the Southwest Grass-Fed Livestock Alliance for sharing their survey results with us to help us calibrate our model as well. And then we're also looking at economic modeling. So we all know it's not sustainable if you can't make money at it, right? You're going to go out of business. It doesn't matter how well you take care of the land if you can't make it. So clearly also the other is true. So when some of the challenges ranchers face include things like changing climates, bringing new risks and challenges that might not have been there in the past, or might be intensifying, like more frequent droughts, hotter and drier droughts, which means that future environmental conditions are a little bit uncertain. The land is changing with the environment. And add to that the low profit margins within ranching. So how do managers respond? What can they do about this? Sustainably managing how people use ecosystems requires understanding of not just the economics, but also the ecologic feedbacks and risks. And one of the options we're looking at is, can breed choice be a method to deal with this uncertainty? So can we take a more desert adapted cattle like the Raramuri Criollo and run those on the land so that they need a little bit less feed? So as the forage quality starts to decline, or as the forage starts to become more brush and less grasses, we get a breed that can get in there and eat those. Western US rangelands. I mean, we all know what these Western rangelands look like. They can be very difficult to manage. They can be too hot, too dry, too steep. Again, these Criollo are pretty good. So I'm told they're pretty good climbers. They like to get out and they'll get up in the high country. Livestock grazing is one of many ecosystem services. Ranching also has some economic and some cultural significance. Some people, they're doing it not just for the money, but also for the way of life. Potential for habitat degradation without careful management in a lot of these fragile landscapes. On the flip side of that, with a well thought out grazing plan, it can be a critical tool to make improvements on the range. The most recent concept in rangeland management, and I think this is probably not a very new concept, it's just coming more to the forefront, is just a move towards holistic ecosystem management. So not just managing for grazing, but also managing for wildlife, riparian habitat, maybe endangered plant species, etc. So the effects of climate change in the Southwest, we are expecting to see higher temperatures, more variability in precipitation. Native plants face a risk of becoming less viable under future climate conditions. Matt McIntosh, who you heard from earlier, did a study on the Chihuahuan Desert and found that the rangeland grasses are in fact actually declining. And this was based on about 40 years of data, and that the brush and shrubs were starting to encroach and take over more. So how does that impact, existing or future migrations of invasive weeds? Are we going to see even more invasives coming into the area? So what we're doing is we're simulating the returns on the range under climate change. So how might climate change affect the risk of rangeland degradation, vulnerability to invasive species? How is the value of the rangeland ecosystems and services being affected by environmental conditions changing? And we're using a 20-year time horizon for this simulation, using ordered logit and Monte Carlo simulations to run these models. And we're looking at, like I said earlier, can the breed choice be something that could help impact whether you stay sustainable on the land or not? So we're looking at a comparison of the traditional English breeds and the Criollo. So we're running the model on the English breeds, running the model on the Criollo, seeing if there is in fact a statistically significant difference or not. And looking at also a comparison of the counterfactual no climate change. So looking at what happens with no climate change and what happens with climate change to kind of tease out where the differences might be with those two scenarios. And the climate change, there we go. And the climate change scenario we're looking at is the RCP 8.5. And basically that's the business as usual if we don't take any mitigation strategies. So that's sort of our worst case scenario. And then the no change scenario is our best case scenario. The reality is we're probably going to end up being somewhere in the middle here. We're using as the model inputs, we're using a ranch called the Corona Ranch where broom snakeweed is a problem. And looking at a 30-year ecological data set from that ranch, so we can kind of really compare past conditions as well as modeling the future conditions and how those affect the broom snakeweed in this case. And cost and return enterprise budgets for both English and the Criollo breeds. So the next steps are to simulate the ranch level returns under all of these scenarios I just described, determining whether the breed choice impacts the profitability and sustainability, determining if the breed choice impacts the invasion of the snakeweed on this ranch, and determining if the breed choice affects the ability to continue ranching at all under climate change. And with that, I'd like to thank all of the people involved with this project and the USDA National Food and Agriculture for funding the project.